Morning, everybody. My name is Mark Miller. I'm the forum chairperson. George Bledsoe is back there doing the technology, which is always a huge job. Lorraine is here today as well. Without further ado, we're going to have Diane and introduce the speaker.
Good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to the Sunday Forum. I'm Diana Dentino, a member since a long time. And I take great pleasure in introducing our speaker today, a very timely topic, especially with what's been going on in just the last week about them booting all the DEIA programs nationally. Anyway, our presenter today is Katy Schmidt Hagmeyer. Katy is a licensed certified social worker. She is a well-known leader in the Wisconsin deaf community here. She is the owner of Deaf Inspired, LLC, and she provides clinical and community-based services. She has an extensive background in mental health with a specific interest in trauma and language deprivation. Katy has experience in leadership development, healthcare management, and education. Katy is a former president of the Wisconsin Association for the Deaf and currently serves on several governor-appointed councils statewide. Katy holds master's degrees in social work and school psychology and a certification in trauma-informed care. I want to give a shout out to Juliet Hills, who brought this idea for a topic to present to our community. As I said earlier, it couldn't have been better timed. And I'm wondering if anybody here is unfamiliar with the interpreting process. Have you ever attended a meeting or some service and there's been a little interpreter off to the side? Because if anything about this process you have a question about, I'm going to invite you to ask Katy about that. Might be a new experience for you. I just got word from this interpreter, our interpreter Sandy, that the current administration has done away with all the interpreters in Washington, D.C. that did federal interpretation. So that'll be an interesting experience. Then also, as we welcome Katy here, I want to show you, instead of applauding, deaf culture is this, and you may know that, you may not. So let's all give Katy a warm First Church welcome. It's yours, Katy. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me to give this presentation. I know this topic can be very extensive. I have presented on this topic, I'm going to try to condense 90 minutes into 40 minutes. And also we can have another opportunity in the future. So I have different topics that I could present on in the future if you're interested. But I want to warn you before we go forward that we are working in 2 different languages. And sometimes the process of interpreting can take a long time. So you may see the interpreter give me a stop signal, and then I will wait for the interpreter to finish the voice interpretation. So please, next slide. I want to thank Diana for that wonderful introduction. I was born into a family that could hear. I was born deaf. We do not know the etiology behind the cause of my deafness. I am a strong bilingual language person. I am fluent in both American Sign Language as well as English. I will explain further about education, but I have experienced a residential deaf school where students stay on campus. I have experienced being mainstreamed into a classroom where I was the only deaf person. So I have a good, wide experience of education as a deaf person. Next slide, please. I'm just going to touch quickly on what a deaf person looks like. There's a wide range. There are individuals that are profoundly deaf, like my partner, Lisa. She has deaf family members that have been passed on genetically. I am a sensory neural person. I did not become deaf because of genetics. Something caused my deafness. There are some people who lose their hearing prelingually before they acquire language, which is my situation. I was born deaf, so I never was exposed to an auditory language. There are late deafened individuals who have acquired language prior to losing their hearing, and that can be caused to meningitis, rubella, measles. There are different influences that can cause hearing loss. Late deafen could be related to experiencing a car accident, could be related to medications that can cause deafness, and the range of language use within the deaf community. Some people are very strong users of American Sign Language. I'm going to go over this terminology. Obviously, deaf, that is how I like to be described. Not all individuals who have a hearing loss want to be called deaf. It depends on their view of themselves on the spectrum. Hard of hearing is the biggest group of people with hearing loss. Many individuals lose their hearing post-lingual acquisition. That is the largest population. Some hard of hearing individuals can use sign language, and some do not. There are also a group of deaf individuals who are deaf-blind, and that typically is caused from charge, Wartenberg's disease, some sort of illness. Most deaf individuals do have some vision, deaf-blind individuals, and they may use a form of communicating called tactile signing. Late deafened adults are typically people who lose their hearing right away. The former president of Gallaudet University, I. King Jordan, lost his hearing through a motorcycle accident. And he decided to learn sign language so that he could be heavily involved in the deaf community. So he is an individual who lost his hearing later on in life. And the last category, hearing loss, is an umbrella term. When I work with clients, which are people who have a hearing loss, I ask them, how do you identify yourself? Some will say, I'm deaf. Others will say, I'm a hard of hearing person. And others have not really identified with one category or another. So that's where we start our journey. Hearing difficulties is an interesting term. The federal government chose that phrase because on a survey, they will ask, do you have hearing difficulties? And that category is not correctly labeled, but that's how they ask on the survey. I want to talk about CODAs, C-O-D-A, and CODA, K-O-D-A. CODA is a child of deaf adults. Our interpreter is a CODA. Her parents were deaf. And then we have KODA. CODAs have the privilege of being able to immerse themselves in both deaf culture as well as the hearing culture. So they are a bridge for many deaf to help them navigate the hearing culture as well as vice versa. Next slide, please. So I want to share some statistics. This is from the American Wisconsin survey. There are approximately 213,000 people with hearing difficulties. And I feel that that number is underreported. And the reason, I was born deaf. I don't have any sense or understanding what the ability to hear is like. So I don't consider myself having hearing difficulties. I don't know what it's like. There's some kind of sound that's static that's interfering. Could it be the two mics giving feedback to each other, maybe? That's it, whatever happened. Thank you. Are we good to go? Okay, so I'm going to back up just a little bit. So on the American Community Survey that they send out to people, which is kind of ridiculous, but they send it out about every 5 years. There's a question on there that says, do you have hearing difficulties? Myself, as a deaf person, being born deaf, I don't know what it's like to hear. I do not check that box because I don't have a sense or any kind of understanding what it's like to hear. And many deaf individuals feel that way. They do not check that box. So that may be a reason that the number is underreported. Next slide, please. Now, let's talk a little bit about intersectionality and what our community looks like. We are the same as majority individuals. We have abilities, we have a culture, identity, education, and socioeconomic factors. But let me give you an example of culture. We have our own culture. We have traditions, customs, norms. Research has proved this, that there is deaf culture, just like there are other cultures. We satisfy the criteria. Our culture depends on visual. Open floor space. For example, my home, and typically when you go into a deaf person's home, the floor plan is very open so that sight lines can be used and they can sign to each other from room to room. They don't have to be in the same room. Another part of our culture, we are great with hugs. When we see each other, we hug. When we leave each other, we hug. Deaf individuals tend to be blunt. We will say what's on our mind, but it's with good intention. So maybe a person that you haven't seen for a while has not. So if a person I have not seen for a while has gained weight, when I see that person, I will say, wow, you've gotten heavy. And there's no ill means behind that comment. You know, sometimes we play with two different cultures. We have a Black deaf individual who identifies both with the Black community as well as the deaf community. The Black individual has their own culture, plus they have the deaf culture. Wisconsin also has a very large population of Hmong, and their culture is very interesting, and it's very challenging compared to other cultures. Other cultures typically will accept deaf individuals, but the Hmong community is different because they believe in clans, they believe in living together. You can have multi-generation family members living in one house. They believe in marriage within their sect. And one sect may have a small number of individuals. And the opportunity to marry someone in the same culture is not readily available. So they look to non-Hmong cultures. And that causes a lot of cultural conflicts between the Hmongs beliefs as well as the other culture. They want to be able to have families, they want to have communication access to language, so that can cause cultural conflicts. I did mention identity. So there is a great range of how individuals identify within the deaf community. Deaf, hard of hearing, deaf blind, plus individuals often have a second identity. And it's interesting how they organize their identity. I identify myself as a deaf woman that is part of the LGBT community. So I have 3 identities. Some people will say I am a Black deaf person. So they identify with the Black culture first, and secondly with the deaf culture. So it's interesting to see how individuals identify themselves. With education, deaf people get education in various ways. They can attend a residential school. It's very much like a boarding school. They stay on campus and they have 100% access to communication. I attended a residential school for the deaf and I had complete access. Other deaf individuals are mainstreamed, where by there may be several deaf individuals placed within a classroom of students that can hear. I was the only deaf person in my class of students that could hear. I had no peers. I didn't have the ability to have conversations with my classmates, and that led to a lot of isolation. Compared to the past, deaf economics have greatly changed. Many doors have been opened. In the 1950s and 1960s, there were only 4, maybe 5 job possibilities for deaf people: to be a teacher, post office, which doesn't need communication, woodworking, the printing industry. Those are all very limited availability for job opportunities. Once ADA passed, the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehab Act, our opportunities have grown. We have deaf doctors, veterinarians, pilots. So many doors have been opened within many, many fields. And what has resulted is economic growth, because those jobs give availability to deaf individuals to earn higher incomes. The deaf community has various abilities. We have a grassroots community. We have deaf people working at Google, working on AI, artificial intelligence. So there's a wide range of abilities within the deaf community. It's not limited at all. I love this slide. Oh, next slide, sorry. Okay, I love this slide. It's humorous, but this is what happens in my life. I get these questions all the time. You don't look deaf. And I think that's an interesting perspective. What is a deaf person supposed to look like? Deaf people have the ability to identify another deaf person without them identifying themselves. Wednesday night, I flew home. I was at the airport, and most of the time I will let the desk know, please let me know when it's time to board. But that night I was so tired, I didn't want to take the effort to walk to the desk. So I just sat there on my phone, and a man walked up to me, tapped me on the shoulder, and signed to me, we're ready to board. I don't know how he identified me. I didn't have a sign on that said I'm deaf. So I asked him, how did you know I'm deaf? And he said, I could tell because you were constantly checking the board. He was somebody who is a CODA, child of a deaf adult, had deaf parents, and he recognized me as a deaf person. Years ago, this is really old research. Deaf teachers could teach up to third grade. They thought that that was about the extent of a deaf person's ability to learn. And thankfully, things have changed considerably. Yes, we can drive. We have research that shows deaf people are very good drivers. A question I get, does your interpreter live with you? No, of course not. What is it like to be deaf? I think that's an interesting question for me because I've never experienced what it's like to be able to hear. I have no idea. So for me, it's an interesting question. I often get asked, can you read lips? Well, I will say no. And the person will say, but you just read my lips. And I said, I have seen that question thousands of times. So I can figure out that the person is asking me if I can read lips. But if I were to continue having a conversation with that person, I would not be able to read their lips. I also get asked if I would like to see information in Braille. Obviously, that's not going to help me. Let's talk about wheelchairs. I flew to Dallas last week. I got off the plane and I saw my name on a wheelchair. I don't need a wheelchair. I just need assistance when to get on the plane because I can't hear the announcements coming over the loudspeakers. So that's the only accommodation I need. I do not need the wheelchair. Next slide, please. Obviously, we have deaf culture. But scientists do argue, even though research says we meet the criteria for being a culture, that deafness is part of a disability. There's a lot of contention with that thinking. Related to religion, in the Bible, Isaiah has one verse that says that a deaf person can be healed and become an individual that can hear. in another part of the Bible says that we are part of the diversity that God created. So the first perspective is that we need to fix somebody who's deaf, as opposed to the second, where we are fine as we are. Just leave us be. Some individuals have the opportunity to receive a cochlear implant, but I need to think about, well, what does my life look like? It has a huge impact on a deaf person's life. First of all, if you get a cochlear implant, it means that you cannot ever have an MRI. So if you have a serious health issue, that has to be removed before they can do an MRI because of the magnet. I have a friend who was in a car accident that had a cochlear implant, and he had a scar, and the doctor looked at it, went ahead and put the individual into the MRI machine, and it actually ripped the device out of his head and ended up having to have surgery and, of course, suing the doctor and the hospital. But when I heard that story, I thought, it is a huge risk to have a cochlear implant. Same as going scuba diving. You can't experience the water pressure when you have a cochlear device. And now we are talking about eugenics. And what they do, they will, if there is a deaf gene within an egg, they will eliminate the egg. So what they are trying to do is eliminate deafness. It may destroy the deaf community a little bit, but not really, because 90% of children that are born deaf is not through hereditary means. With eugenics, there is a big controversy. Years ago, one man, Laughlin, he looked at deafness as individuals who needed to be sterilized. Of course, that plan failed because deaf people revolted. Another person, Alexander Graham Bell, we know him as the inventor of the telephone, but he had a deaf wife. And he felt that the deaf community as a race was threatening. He wanted to have a law forbidding deaf individuals from marrying other deaf individuals because it would pass on that deaf gene. Next slide, please. Deaf equity. I know individuals have different definitions as to what does deaf equity mean. For deaf equity, I look at it as an asset, untapped abilities, knowledge that people can contribute to society. For example, if I go into McDonald's and I order food, this is just an example, the cashier will either say, oh, okay, they give me paper and pencil, So obviously that person has experienced an encounter with a deaf individual. Others will stand there like a deer in headlights. They have no idea what to do. And I will, take some of the paper from the receipt and write my order. So that becomes a learning experience for that individual. Oh, a deaf person can take care of themselves. They are able to do this. They can order. There are a lot of unknowns. Many individuals have never met a deaf person, and they're not sure how to communicate. They're not sure whether or not they're going to offend the deaf person. Deaf and hard of hearing individuals are very open. Do you want me to ask for the interpreter? Do you want to write back and forth? I can communicate through video relay service, and the deaf person will offer suggestions and educate a person who is not familiar with somebody who is deaf. That a deaf person will take responsibility and help educate that person to be able to communicate together. The bias is interesting. I had a conversation recently with my dad about jobs, about employment, and how the impact of giving deaf individuals opportunities to work in various fields. Suppose somebody wants to work in a bank. The bank job typically uses phones as part of their job duties. So a bank may look at it, I'm concerned about hiring a deaf person because they need to be able to use a phone. But there are so many options. They can use video relay service, they can communicate through text, and they have a direct connection to the deaf community. Deaf people could bring business to the bank where there is a deaf person working because it eliminates the middle person. They can have direct communication. They have the economic power. They want to borrow money. They want to buy a home. So it's a win-win for both. It's a win for the bank as well as a win for the deaf community. When you think about a deaf lens, there's so much bias with employment. Marketing, when I want to buy a product or a service, I look on the website and I look through the web and I look at a website and see if it offers accommodations. If it does not look like it's accessible for a deaf person, I won't buy the product. I will buy the product where they offer accessibility. When I see a website that offers a variety and diversity in marketing, I will buy my product there because it's accessible for me. A language-rich environment as opposed to a least restrictive environment. Some of you, when you hear LRE, through your work experience, you know that it's a least restrictive environment. But that is from a hearing person's perspective. But really, is it? I like to look at LRE as a language-rich environment, which is conducive to our language. If you notice, we have closed captioning, and not only deaf people benefit from it, because sometimes hearing individuals can be talking to each other and they miss a point. they can go back and see what is being discussed or what was said. I know I'm running over time here. This is, next slide, please. There are different resources, and first of all, there's TAP and TAP that can be used for any person who is deaf, hard of hearing, or has a hearing loss. It is equipment. We have bed shakers, lights, and that costs money. And these programs cover the cost to provide accessibility for someone who has a hearing loss. There is the Office of Deaf and Hard of Hearing. If you're not sure of laws or resources for deaf and hard of hearing, you can contact ODHH. There also is the Wisconsin Educational Services Program for deaf and hard of hearing. For school education, where a student can be placed, what kind of services they require. We also have the Wisconsin Association of the Deaf, and then there is the Hearing Loss Association of America, Wisconsin chapter. Thank you. Next slide. So, if you are interested in receiving a copy of my PowerPoint, I have the QR code up here, and I just want to thank you all. I know I rushed through this. This typically is a 90-minute presentation, so I just briefly touched on each topic. So at this point, I'm just going to say, does anybody have any questions?
Thank you. Hi, Katy. My name is BJ, and you may know me as the First Church Hearing Assistance Volunteer. Sorry, I don't have my badge on. I want to point out that, yes, there had been huge problems with the initial cochlear implants that you could not use, but now all 3 manufacturers of cochlear implants are MRI compatible, and the audiologist is very, very careful. Oh, sorry. Is this better? I'm sorry, do you want me to just slide on that phone?
Step over this way to the podium, just step closer.
I'm sorry. How's that? Sorry about that. The audiologists and the surgeons that now fit cochlear implants, and this, I don't know how far back this goes, quite some years, but they will be very clear about which, there's actually 2 kinds of MRIs. They talk extensively about that because I know it was part of my decision which cochlear implant to go with. And at that time, that was 7 years ago, one of the manufacturers was not MRI compliant. I said, well, I'm not using them. So, but that they are now all compliant. And thank you, Katy, because you made me realize I really need to get a bracelet, you know, just as with people with penicillin allergies, that says, I have this MRI, and here is the serial number, so that they can contact Freightert to get all the information. So and like so many things, that technology changes all the times. And you probably know I use captions all the time as well, because depending on speakers, even with the loop that is in this room, it's still just like life. It is speaker dependent. If the person kind of doesn't move their, yeah, I'm lost. So captions are fairly universal. So just wanted to add that. And and they're especially good for people who have hearing loss but are in denial about it. And we can never capture those people on surveys, and we don't have numbers on how many people that is. This was outstanding. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you for that addition, and it seems there's a question in back.
How universal is ASL in
Well, that's an interesting question. In the United States, our sign language is actually borrowed from French Sign Language. Most of our signs look like French Sign Language, just like English follows UK English. If I were to go to France, it'd be easy for me to communicate. If I went to the UK, it would be different. Their sign language incorporates the use of two hands as opposed to American Sign Language, which relies mostly on the dominant hand. There are different varieties of sign language. There is Spanish Sign Language. We do have dialects within the United States. It's regional. What you see here in Wisconsin can be very different from sign language that is used in Florida. So there are different dialects. Does that answer your question?
should we not assume that everyone in the every deaf person in the United States speaks sign language? Okay.
No. With technology, with new additions, not all deaf people use sign language. Maybe their parents never gave that child an option to develop sign language, and they didn't know about sign language until they became older. And they often have regrets that they lost that time where they would have been able to develop that ability. You have a question over here?
First statement, I often enjoy watching the people with sign language better than the speakers because they often are so expressive in how they present their language and looks on their face. I was wondering is there a universal sign language that a deaf person from anybody, any culture can use, or is it always pretty local like dialect, as you said?
Well, you asked me a two-part question. First of all, more and more when there are TV advertisements for emergency situations, they will have an interpreter on screen. And people say, even though they don't know American Sign Language, they can tell how serious the situation or emergency is just by the grammatical features on the interpreter's face. They realize that this is a very serious, dire emergency. So even though they don't know sign language, they can denote the extremity of the situation. And your second part, we do have universal sign language, just to know, where there are standards of what signs can be used during international conferences, international events, and that can be a mixture of American Sign Language, UK, British Sign Language, Spanish Sign Language. It's more iconic signs so that everyone, no matter which country they are from, are able to understand each other. Are there any more questions? Again, I want to thank you for this opportunity.